G'day guys, and in today's video we're going to investigate scrap Damascus. What steel do we use and how do we prepare a billet for welding? So, what we have here is a kind of a layout of the Damascus that I'm going to be making for the next video, going into how to actually weld up. But before we get to that, I figured we'd cover a little bit of what I'm using, what materials. Now, we've discussed in my previous heat treating videos. If you haven't seen those, please go and check them out. Obviously, they'll be on my channel, but you can also check the links in the description. I'll hopefully link them up if I remember. But we've discussed how to discover decent scrap steel versus bad scrap steel. And all of this is scrap that I've just got laying around in my shop. So we have files. Obviously, this is a half-round file, which isn't ideal, but I cut up all of my flat files to make into Damascus billets. So this is representative. We also have leaf spring, which again I covered previously. This is from that spring manufacturer. I know this is SUP 9. We have mild steel, which is part of the billet I welded up for my Japanese sledgehammer video, which is currently sitting in billet form. And we also have some bandsaw. Now this is actually metal cutting bandsaw from a metal plant that does a lot of sheet metal work and stuff like that. What you want is a nice wide band. Obviously this is quite thin. So in the cases where I've mounted up versus some very thick material, I've tripled it up or doubled it up to get that extra thickness. And that'll show as a single white line. It won't show as multiple layers. So it only counts as one. As Gimli would say. But before we get into that, I just wanted to discuss a little bit about the behaviors of each steel when being forged. Now, if you're forge welding mild steel to file steel, the file steel is going to move a lot slower under the hammer than the mild steel will. Anyone who's tried to forge a knife out of a file or tried to forge something out of mild steel will know that mild steel moves a lot easier under the hammer, which is also true when you're making Damascus. So if you've got file steel and mild steel in a billet, like we did in yesterday's billet, or the billet from my Japanese sledgehammer video, the mild steel will squish a lot faster than the file steel will. So you've got to be very careful of that when you go to manipulating the billet. The same can be said of the leaf spring steel, and especially because the leaf spring steel is significantly thicker than most of the other pieces of steel, you're going to have a lot less movement in that than the rest of the billet. So that becomes really important when we come to actually using or stacking the billet ready for welding. So there are several processes in Damascus. It's not just the simple, throw it together and throw it in the forge. To get a really good weld on Damascus, first off, you need to know what materials you're using and whether they will contrast. Now, I know for a fact that the file steel and spring steel and bandsaw that I use will all contrast really well. They're all of a high carbon steel. The leaf spring is about 0.6%. So is the bandsaw, although the teeth are actually a little bit higher carbon. These have been hard pointed, but I grind those off prior to stacking, as you can see with the billets. And obviously the file steel is about 0.95% carbon. So with that being said, I know that it's going to provide fairly good contrast, and I'll show you that in a later step. But first, we need to cut them to roughly the same size. They don't need to be exactly the same size. As you can see, they're all a little bit different sized. And I haven't bothered truing up the ends. Now, if I wanted to get a really, really clean welding, I'd want to get them all precisely the same size. And if you have the ability to do that or the patience to do that, go ahead. I don't. In the end, most of the time you're going to lose a small piece at the end where the ends aren't going to weld properly together because they're out in the air and they're going to oxidize faster than everything else and they're not going to weld together properly. So I'm already willing to sacrifice that section. I also haven't cleaned the edges of my files because, again, that's all going to get sacrificed to grinding and stuff like that because the edges very rarely weld together properly, especially if you don't have something like a hydraulic press. But that being said, the cleaner and the more even you can make it, the better. These are kind of stacked together for speed rather than rather than for neatness. So we have 3 billets here, and obviously the 4th billet, which is the file steel and mild steel. We've got a billet of file steel and bandsaw, which is the W2 equivalent, and some 15 and 20 equivalent. We have file steel and leaf spring, and then we have leaf spring and bandsaw. And the main reason I'm making these is because then I could show you the contrast of those after they've been welded together, which will be at the end of the video. So, the first most important step after sizing your billets is to clean the surfaces. Now, these are not clean. These have been ground, but after cutting and all that kind of stuff, they've developed that surface oxidization. They've also been left out a little bit. So the first step we've got to do is head over to the grinder and grind those surfaces clean. So that's what we're going to do now. So when preparing a Damascus billet, the first thing we need to do is clean these surfaces. I'm also going to chamfer each edge just to give myself a little bit more leeway for the borax to squirt out. In the event that you're doing this with an angle grinder, try and grind more from the edges than from the center. In the end, having something that looks ovular in shape is much better than having something that's got a dish in the middle. Because remember, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is have the borax squirt out of the join before it gets trapped inside the steel. And that's all it takes. In this case, I've got a very flat platen, so I don't have to worry about it too much. And I don't have to have a super clean surface as far as grit goes. This is only a very worn out 50 grit, and that gives me a nice clean surface to then weld to the other pieces. Okay, so the inside of our billet is nice and clean. Doesn't matter about the outside as well, that's not going to weld. But now that we've got it nice and clean, the bandsaw is slightly bent, and a lot of the time you're going to have slight variations in straightness in your billet. The flatter you can get something, the easier it is going to be to weld. But we can somewhat mitigate that by straightening it up in our fingers and then clamping it in a vise. Or if you don't have a vise, you could use a clamp. Funnily enough, G-clamp or an F-clamp. If you have a drill vise, those are actually really useful because you can lay the billet on the drill vise base. And that's nice and square, and that means that you'll keep the billet nice and square. In this case, if there's any lack of squareness, all we need is a hammer, and we can just tap it straight as it needs to be, so that all the surfaces are in contact, and then clamp it down nice and hard. One thing I didn't mention in the earlier intro was that you want to keep the thick material on the outside of your billet. The thinner the material, the more likely it is to bow in the heat, because obviously metal expands when it's heated up. And what happens is that the metal wants to force itself away from the heat. It's trying to force itself longer, but it can't do that if it's trapped at each end. So it's going to try and expand on you. The thicker material will resist that expansion, whereas the thinner material will literally bow out. And given that we're going to do one of these billets in the charcoal forge, if that bowing occurs, we're going to end up with charcoal in between our welding surfaces, and that's going to completely inhibit the weld. So now that it's clamped, and clamped as hard as we possibly can, we're going to fire up the welder, and I'm going to run a bead down both sides, one at the front end and one at the back end. And then if this was a longer billet or a slightly taller billet, I would also run one up each side, or potentially two, depending on how large the billet is. These are very small billets for demonstrative purposes. But the larger the billet, the more you want it consolidated and welded up as hard as you possibly can, because you don't want that expansion happening and opening up all your gaps. Right, now because this is such a small billet, just turn the welder off, we're going to end up not needing to weld the sides up, mainly because the material is so thick for such a short billet that it's not going to expand. And now with both ends welded, it's not going to come apart. So the next step is that I want to weld a handle onto this, because while you can work Damascus with tongs, like I'm holding right now, although these are bladesmithing tongs, it's much easier to work with a handle. And if you've already welded it up, then you can obviously weld a handle onto it. Now, if you don't have a handle, that does not mean you can't make Damascus. All you need is baling wire or hose clamps. Stainless steel hose clamps also work. Stainless steel won't weld in an oxygenated environment no matter how much flux you put on it. So if you use stainless steel hose clamps to clamp this all together, they won't weld. You simply knock them off at the end of the forge welding experience. If you use baling wire, it will eventually burn off during the forge welding heats. So you don't have to worry about forging that into your billet too much. That being said, if you do that, you're going to have an issue with holding onto it. And what I would recommend is leaving one piece of the material, normally in the middle, much longer so that you can grasp that with tongs outside the billet. In this case, I don't need to do that because I can weld a handle on, so that's what I'm going to do now. Just something I noticed while I was stacking this billet, which I thought I'd cover. As you can see this really nasty grinder mark here where I obviously skipped off with the angle grinder when cutting this out of the leaf spring. If I was to put this on the side that's actually going to be welded, that would create a pocket of flux. And flux does not weld. You know, borax doesn't weld itself. It squirts out of the way after covering the steel and protecting it from oxidization. So that would immediately become an inclusion in my Damascus, which would mean that that part will not have welded, which is a weak point in a knife, and if we're making a knife out of this, that could potentially cause a failure. There's also another one there. So I cleaned the other side, and that one's perfectly flat, so we're good to go with this one. But if I had found that on both sides, or if this one was supposed to be a middle section for some reason, I would want to grind that completely out before I got to it. Before I put it in the billet, because otherwise I'm asking for trouble. So for those of you who thought I was going to let you get away without bringing out the whiteboard, I'm very sorry, but it's not going to happen in this video. But I just wanted to draw a graphic representation of what I was talking about when I was cleaning the steel. In my case, I've made flat billets, and I know that they're perfectly flat because I'm using the platen on my grinder, which is perfectly flat. This allows the borax to squirt out when pressure is applied to the center, because the center is going to dip these in and squirt it out. But in the event that I was using an angle grinder and you happen to keep the disc in the center of the piece for too long, and it doesn't have to be this bad, it just has to have a slight dip, then you're creating a pocket, and even if you strike in the middle, these edges are going to weld first, and that means that you're going to end up with a pocket of borax or just iron oxide in the billet, which is going to mean that your forge weld is never going to work. Even when done with a flat piece, obviously you have the high points that are going to weld onto the flat piece, and even if you've got a concave piece, unless the concave is larger than the dip that you've got, you're not going to hit the center before you hit the edges. So if you're going to use something that's not quite as reliable or flat as my grinder, or say a surface grinder or something like that, then you want to go for this ovular kind of look. Doesn't have to be, again, it doesn't have to be this bad. You could have flat sides and stuff like that, but if the surfaces themselves are contoured outwards, with the high point being in the center, then these are going to make contact first, which means that all of the material outside of that is going to squirt out. So that's why when you're cleaning and grinding a material, you want to aim for this shape. And again, just to show, that contour is not quite as large as this contour here is. So you're going to end up welding at the edges and still creating a pocket, no matter how well you do it. So yeah, if you're going to use something that's inefficient, like a grinder or files, try for an ovular look. And even if you just bevel the edges to give it a little bit more space, that's going to give you a major advantage when it comes to actually welding. Okay, so here we are back at the table with our offcuts of our Damascus. Now, these are offcuts from the very ends of Damascus. This one actually has some of the weld bead still showing, that little blur in it. So there are a couple of inclusions, but the inclusions are quite natural to the ends of Damascus billets, and the more we'd worked these, the less inclusions there would be. But we've only done light welding passes on all of these, trying to just get them to stick, to give you an idea of the contrast that you can get. Now, on the left here, we have file steel and bandsaw blade. And you can see the file steel is etched dark and the bandsaw blade is etched light. Now, this is only etched with ferric chloride, and ferric chloride is not very good for contrast, plus this is just a machine finish. I'm going to do an entirely different video on etching Damascus, but you can see that the light is the bandsaw, the dark is the file steel. On this billet, this was the file steel and spring steel, and you can see that the dark in this case is the file steel, and the spring steel is our light. Actually, no, it's the other way around. Our file steel is actually our light steel. It's interesting. A lot of the time, this has all been heat treated because the pattern won't show up properly until you've heat treated them. For some reason, I think we may actually have a deeper etch on the file, but for some reason they're showing lighter at the moment. A lot of contrast comes from the depth of the etch, and then you sand back the high spots. I haven't done that on these, I've just dunked them in ferric. And again, that will be part of the Damascus making, but it could be that this specific sub-9 and this leaf spring has some high manganese or something like that to create the darker pattern. But that's very interesting. Even more interesting is this little billet here. Bring it up to the camera because it's quite interesting. You can see the weld bead on this side here, but you'll notice that the file steel, which is the dark lines, has dark lines on the edges but is light in the center. That's because I used an Pakistani-made case-hardened file, and I was hoping that it would show something quite interesting, and it has. Now, this is the file steel and mild steel, so this was never meant to be a blade. This is actually, the billet that this is made of is going to be a jacket over some 52-100 bearing steel that we're eventually going to make into something. But you can see it makes a really interesting pattern. I really like it, and Mick was admiring it earlier. But yeah, so you've got the darkness of the high carbon, the case hardening, and then the two lighter steels are both mild steel, just standard A36. And then last but not least, we have some leaf spring and our bandsaw blade, and this is obviously etched. The bandsaw blade quite dark, and the bandsaw blade quite light, and the spring steel quite dark. I've seen a couple of videos where people have etched various things separately and then tried to show that they are contrasting, but realistically, until you put them in a Damascus pattern, until you actually put them together and weld them, you're not going to be able to see the contrast, such as in this case. And even, comparing them apples to apples next to each other, you'll see that the leaf spring on the bandsaw blade one etched lighter than the leaf spring on the file steel one, and that could purely be the fact that this spent a little bit longer in the acid, or there's so many different ways to screw up the acid. Now, these were all washed down with acetone before dunking, and that's something I'll go into in etching. But bandsaw, file, spring steel, and mild can make all different kinds of contrasting patterns. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you really enjoyed learning how to prep a Damascus billet. And if you want to see how I went about welding these together, stay tuned for Wednesday's video next week on how to forge weld. This is part of the heat treating series and steel series deep dives that I've been doing. If you want to check those out, I actually have a playlist. I will link that in a card up here. If you want to subscribe to the channel, just hit this little icon down here, and then make sure you hit that bell notification icon to be notified of when I upload new videos. On top of that, I would really like to thank my patrons, Jared, Nathan, Andy, Kyan, Rich, and Braden. You guys are all fantastic people. You guys keep a hammer in my hand, gas in the tank, belts on the grinder. I really, really appreciate your support, guys. If you want to join the Patreon crew and get access to background videos and behind the scenes and bloopers, plenty of those from this video series. Go ahead and go check that out. The link will be down in the description below. But with that being said, I'm going to jump off. It's hot. I'm done for the day. Again, I will see you next Wednesday for the Damascus forge welding video. But if you want to check in with me before that, I have a live stream on Saturday at 9 AM Australian Western Standard Time. So hopefully I'll see you there. Cheers, guys.